Hello and welcome. I'm Ivan Kerrigan, and today I'm speaking with Daniel Gross. Daniel started a company that Apple acquired where he then worked on data products. He then became a partner at Y Combinator and then started his own accelerator that's very gamified called Pioneer. And I tried to ask Daniel about how to run data-based products, but we actually ended up having a much deeper conversation about product overall, and especially how Apple runs things a little bit differently than everyone else. So if you're curious about product management and product management specifically at Apple, this is a conversation for you. Without further ado, I bring you Daniel Gross. How teams run well when you're working on a data product. And you've worked on a few different things here at Apple, including your last startup. And I think this dynamic is interesting because we had this whole lean, iterative approach to building software. But when the data itself is a separate component of the product, it's like you don't have just like a customer interacting with the product. You also have this statefulness within it that I think changes how things move, how you get better. And so like the improvement on the product itself that might be generating data or using data from other sources, it's an interesting dynamic. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think companies should run this, because it's not as straightforward for product.
Right. So the question, just how to use data to kind of inform product decisions?
I think that's actually pretty straightforward. I think it's more around how to organize a product team when the product itself incorporates data. So you can say, for example, how to do a growth team, how to do analytics, and how you inform your decision on that kind of testing. I actually think, that's an interesting topic, but I think that is not quite the same as when the product itself is like a machine learning focused product, whether it's like robotics or some like speech interface or search, like these kinds of tools where the data is a separate entity.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things. One is if there's probably a master question we should address, which is to the extent to which there should be particular product teams versus just engineering teams. And I should mention, I kind of grew up in the house of Apple, which does not have product management as a function. And I vehemently believe, and a lot of people I think will get angry at me for this belief, but I vehemently believe that product management is not a role. It is a function that anyone can do. And so, when I think about organizing teams, I really think in the Apple way, which is you have an engineering lead, a design lead, and usually an SVP. Who's the arbiter if they don't agree. And everyone of those people should be thinking about product. But my mindset is very much that all of this is happening actually within the engineering division, not within a separate product kind of strategy division. This is the Apple mantra. It works, I think, really well if you want to have a lot of centralized control, if you want to do a few things. It does not work really well if you want to federate. That's where the Google, Facebook product management style works. You federate control. For a bunch of reasons.
Early Facebook is worth mentioning here because, not to interrupt, but just really briefly, the way they talked about it is, you need to have some understanding what the user needs. You need to be able to build it, and you need to ship, right? And so there's like a design component in there. There is a logistics side to it, and there's an engineering component. That could be one person that works on that. Later Facebook, not so much. And so the structure of early Facebook as a website with a bunch of pages meant you could federate really, really well. And I think they centralized more and more to a certain extent. But please continue.
Does Facebook have proper? I actually thought product managers actually have a lot of free reign there in the sense that.
Yeah, they do. So you would it depends on the folks. So there's if you look at the first version of Facebook video, I think it was actually a designer and an engineer working on it, and it was like a hackathon project. And so that was the ethos where obviously they knew enough engineering to ship it out. It might have even been two designers. I'm trying to recall the exact structure of the team. And so you could have these PMs that would be representing the user experience and doing the design. They also had a lot of UI engineering tools to make it so that it's relatively easy to make something look Facebook-y just by an engineer working on it. And the whole hackathon ethos was definitely anybody can ship a product. And I think as they matured, then so PMs always had a lot of influence. And as they matured, they would formalize some of these structures. So yeah, so I think talking about Facebook when they're 10 versus 1,000 versus 10,000 or plus, it's very different actual structures of the company.
Yep, that makes total sense. Ultimately, I think all startups, especially the technical companies, start out kind of in the house of Apple and then migrate over time. It is usually the case, often is the story of the founder who needs to be literally broken in order to delegate properly because they're trying to do everything. And by the way, to be totally clear, I think the real distinction here on product management versus engineering management is, do you allow in your organization a product manager who has a limited understanding of the technical underpinnings to be making strategy decisions for what is built? That's really the question. And we can argue both sides of it. The Google, Facebook argument would be yes, because the competencies, it's ultimately impossible to find everyone that's kind of a holy grail, and you want specialization in competencies, and the kind of customer research, UX design competency does not require understanding engineering. I think the Apple approach is a little bit more kind of just old school, 1980s Silicon Valley is, no, it is inexcusable that that the person driving the strategic direction of what you're building does not understand, the API, signature methods that are being used. That's really the distinction. And I will say I was an engineering director there, and I would have meetings with Eddie and Craig and occasionally Tim, and I was expected to both have the strategic vision, but also, because all the engineers reporting to me, I was expected to kind of know like what was going on underneath the hood. It is my understanding that that's fairly similar to how, obviously kind of different markets, but fairly similar to how SpaceX is run.
Interesting.
So I think that's the interesting question. My belief, the reason I kind of end up in the House of Apple is I believe two things. I do not really believe you want to do too many things as a company anyway. Like, I think there's limitations on just overall corporate structure and how many different things you should be doing. I think centralization is somewhat of a goal. And then second, I do think, while noble at heart, when you allow the organization to start hiring non-technical product managers, standards are lowered at the end of the day. Yeah. And before you know it, I think you become I won't say any names, but there's obviously companies we all laugh at in terms of technical competency, and I think that's the root of the evil. Because I should say one final thing, like, if you're going to give an HM any rope to hire, they'll fill whatever headcount you give them. Like, they will fill it. The headcount will be filled, with good people or bad. This isn't really the question we asked, but I think it's a very interesting one.
Yeah. It's also, I think I agree, and I'm saying this as robotics trained software engineer turned product guy, that like, I actually think I'm more technical than most product folks that I've experience with. There are some subtleties here. So on a growth team, whether you can like pull your own SQL queries matters a lot. And so there is like a push within that dimension to be able to answer your own questions, at least, so you don't get constrained by an analyst being available for you. And also, some products are much more technical than others. So if you have, and sometimes that would be reflected in the role. So you have these technical program managers that are more running the ship and need to be tight with engineering, or you can get something that's just a new kind of UI. And the specific implementation might not even be made by that team. And so like the engineering is just much, much lighter. And so it's all, I think the broad trend of engineers, I think I'm Facebooky at heart, which is to say that if the engineer understands the design and the user need and the business case, go and build it. And so the question is how much federation, that's like a separate dimension. But I think the competency is really the point that is really important. Like somebody that's determining what product should be shipped should understand what's under the hood, because that's often what differentiates and protects the product anyway.
There is to your point, there is an interesting middle ground that people often bring up, which is, how should I be thinking about this if I run a sales-driven company, where at the end of the day, we're building we're building Flask and Python and Ruby scripts, and it makes a lot of money, but it's not deep tech. Do I really need to take my engineers and deploy them into sales calls with customers, or should I have sales be running product? And if I let sales kind of make product decisions, then how do we handle the situation where they overpromise and now we're rushing to deliver and the engineers are sad? And just like everything, there's no silver bullet, just lead bullets, to quote. I think that's Ben Horowitz quote. But I think this speaks to me of the overall framework here is that product is it's a function, not a role. It's like, it's a thing different people can do. It could very well be that if the way you set up your kind of holy trinity in your organization, if you're very sales driven, is you have the success lead or the sales lead in general, and then the engineering lead, and then a design lead. Like maybe the person who does product is the salesperson. You know, at Apple, the way the word product isn't really used. The term that's used to kind of figure out where the crown sits is this term called the DRI, directly responsible individual. And it is worth maybe touching on that just for a minute. It's cool for two reasons. One is it bears no relation to the org chart. So you could be the DRI of a project and be buried quite low in the organization, but that kind of means it's your responsibility to do the product work, so to speak, just because you have the DRI label. Second, this thing that's very interesting is there's no guaranteed continuity. So it's interesting to think of a product role as basically tenure, because you know that it's infinite. You're going to have that role forever. Whereas the DRI role, you have to sing for your supper every year at Apple. And it gets a little bit more complicated at Apple because you want to not just be a DRI, you want to be a DRI of what's called a tentpole. That's like Apple's way of saying it's a DRI of an important thing. Every year there's 7 or 8 tentpoles. And you're not guaranteed that year over year. In fact, you're often told you're not going to get it and you have to really beg for it and you have to really perform. And I love that. You know, as saying this as someone who like worked hard to be the DRI of a tentpole every year. And you don't get the structure if you use the physical org chart, because again, that's kind of like guaranteed. You know, you're a product manager this year, you'll be a product manager next year. I really like that, and I think it could be an interesting model for basically any style of company, whether you know it's like a very consumer focused thing or a very enterprise focused thing. Is you basically say, look, we have no product person. The engineering lead could be that product person, it could be the design lead, could be the go to market or sales lead, and we're just going to anoint DRI-ship of it. And so like, like pick an example here, like let's imagine your Typeform, random example. I think that company's in Europe somewhere. And you're trying to figure out if you do your SSO integration or whatever, or just enterprise integration shit. Someone could be a DRI of enterprise integration stuff. And that could be an engineer, that could be a designer, but they'll be a DRI for that for a year, for a quarter, whatever. And it allows you to their responsibility to like figure out what to do it and build it. And you can hold them accountable to it. So, and
it's interesting, the calcification side of this too, because like people talk about how the product ships reflects the org chart. There's a term for that. And having what sounds like more flexibility on who owns what also probably allows you to be more flexible on what you work on. One of the hardest things as you grow is to say, actually, this area of investing is not worth pursuing. And the hard part is you can't help but feel like you're getting kicked out of a tribe and like you're going to die in the wilderness, because it should be better for your career, actually. So you're not getting fired. Your area is not, we're saying this is not important and there's probably something else you should be working on. But then people read that as I'm dying, and not the contrapositive, which is I should continue to work on something that people is not important. This is like not good.
Given an opportunity to work on something that is even more important. I think the way to make that more pleasant for everyone is perhaps to set expectations. That we're going to let's assume this will not be the thing next year. This is a double-edged sword, by the way. I don't think you want to do this strategy for all things. There are core technologies you want to be able to say to the organization, this is a 5-year investment. So for example, like the WebKit team at Apple is just knows. They have engineering cycles for WebKit for a long time. There's a lot of things at Apple that are on super long trains because of hardware. And so like we're working on this thing, hardware is coming in 3 to 4 years. So what I'm describing really works well for the areas of your organization that are kind of just the top of the funnel, the icing on the cake, the things that are changing every year. There are situations in the converse where I think you don't want to have to give people a sense that they'll think for the stuff every year.
The way I often think about that is if you have like an API to a group, then it's very easy to define what that group should do. And it's often means you could have more longevity. So a good example is, I don't actually need to know who's using the API services I'm making. I just need the latency to be low. I just need these queries to be fast. And so if you have that kind of infra team, they have this isolation that allows that to be more permanent. And like lower level technology is certainly a lot like that in many cases. And often it works really well if it can like work well together. But certainly user facing things are much more dynamic and can be cut or grown.
I think that's right. I think the key for scaling an organization is having sustainable coupling points, whether they're visual coupling points, like these guys are responsible for rendering this box here, or API coupling points, to your point. where work can be done with no human interaction. I always used to think of it as how can I set up my teams at Apple so that those guys, if they needed to, could do their work for the entire year, maybe for the next 2 years, without internal VPN access. Like, you don't actually need it. There's like the one thing you're responsible for doing. And I think
I thought you were going to say you don't have to talk to them, which is like an introvert's solution here. It's like a structure the org so that you don't have to actually interact, because that kind of autonomy leads to the best work as well. So there's a reason to want that.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And I think it's not something pleasant to think about for the extroverts, because they really want, I mean, it comes from a beautiful place. You want everyone to be talking to each other and having a good time. But I don't know why exactly, but we have limitations on how much collaboration we can do at mega scale. And I think once I don't know if it's Dunbar's, or once you go beyond a certain number, it just doesn't work. So I think that's extremely true. And I think what's so funny to me about companies right now is we're talking about a lot of things that are kind of rapidly unfolding, because technology businesses are actually pretty young. When you think about it from an evolutionary timescale perspective, it's probably not 1/10 of 1 basis point. If we've been around for 2 million years, Google's like 20 years old. So we're still learning.
You probably start with language, but still, yeah, fair.
And so, right, we probably should start with the Homo sapien. But my point is, I always wonder in my mind, in the Harvard Business Review that's going to come out 200 years from now, what are kind of the very obvious things they're going to say, the very obvious rule? It's illegal to have an organization that's above a certain size, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this might bring it back to the automation side of this, because I can't help but wonder in 200 years whether people will even be making decisions in the same way. Yes. The joke I had actually is a thought experiment. If I could say, hey, Siri, terraform Mars, what would it take for that to work? It's like, just think about under the hood, like all the machines, like some Factorio spin up of what needs to actually happen for that to work in terms of the deployment of resources and making of plans and the timing of what runs where, let alone like the machines and how they work and how they interact. And so getting a little bit less sci-fi, you might have like a strategic level understanding of where you want to go, informed by some kind of projection and prediction about how the world's going to evolve. And then the collaboration could be relatively implicit. Actually, there's a book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, that I think is a perfect analogy here. So in the story there, you have a centralized, and it's like a totally 1960s model computer, which is like a centralized computer that can understand everything. And also most people think it's just like a sense and response computer that will answer your question. But actually it's a conspiracy, I mean, I presume you read the book, is a conspiracy to take over the government. And so it creates a distributed cell of actors, and it's the centralized coordinating point. And so that when you have an agent arrested or whatever, nobody knows anyone else. They literally don't know, because they all communicate with this centralized AI that then distributes the tasks. And so it's not realistic that you wouldn't have federated ML and bots like that. But I think it is realistic that a company would want that kind of effort to say, like, I just want some centralized thinker that everyone can interact with, that, maybe even feels like they're a great boss that loves them or whatever, like cares about their career and actually is able to help with that. And then allows people to have more decision-making coupled with that key strategy without the N squared communication lines required as a firm grows to be able to facilitate that.
Yes.
So going back, you can react to that, but there's also the question here originally, which is, I don't even know if you need to go back to it, but it's like specifically for products that have machine learning, because you've worked on, tell me what you worked on at Apple, and then we could start from there.
Yeah, sure. And we should wrap shortly, but we could try to get this one in. I ran teams that worked on search and just ML broadly across the entire company. I was the DRI of this thing called OS Intelligence, which is Apple's way of saying from apps using ML to figure out when to open and close, to spotlight search, to 900 other things. So it's my job to zip all of that together in some type of coherent narrative and try to make your phone a little bit smarter. And in typical Apple style, not have you really notice any of the effects overtly. It's one very important thing to Apple is, it's kind of underrated. The idea is to just be in the background, let you use your phone. So a lot of really nice things actually that happen on your phone that I could describe to you in detail, that you'd say, wow, yeah, I didn't know, but now that you mention it, but are never going to make it to a keynote, which to me is pretty beautiful, actually. So yeah, I mean, we had all sorts of different. I was also brought in to do. I've realized kind of belatedly, Apple was not very big into tracking any type of metrics, and so we staffed a whole organization to just, when you're doing ML, you kind of need metrics to survive. You can't really shoot in the dark. When we arrived at Apple, the thing that was Spotlight at the time was the results were sorted by some designer somewhere decided first we're going to show some contacts, then we're going to show some photos, then we're going to, it was like literally hard coded. And you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's why, like, when you type in something that's obviously a website, you're getting a partial match on a contact first. That's totally broken. And in order to fix that, you actually have to teach the organization a little bit about analytics and how all of that works. And so, yeah, so, I mean, we had probably the most exciting corporate innovation or organizational innovation we had is at some point we had a broader metrics, how would you say, SEC kind of metrics team. And those guys were responsible for collecting everyone else's metrics, validating them, generally speaking, coming up with hypotheses about why all the collected data and conclusions that team had is probably wrong, which is the case anytime you're collecting a new KPI or a new metric, the team will miscollect and misreport it for the first 3 months. No one's bad, no one's evil, no one gets it right on the first try, especially if these are engagement metrics or subtle things like screen load, screen count, you're just not gonna get it right. And so these kind of SEC guys would kind of go collect metrics, demand metrics from everyone, call bullshit on bad data. And that was very helpful to just have a regulatory body there that could kind of patrol around pretty much any team at Apple, actually, at some point, because we were a tentpole, we kind of had this right, and try to demand, accuracy, validity, and data from them. I should mention one final thing, which is Apple famously does not really design by metrics, and I actually think that's very good and very correct. Metrics are really used to, locally maximize things, not to globally maximize. So, we use metrics to make sure that, when you type in Safari search on your iPhone, the type ahead completions kind of sort properly and you get what you want. They would not use that to figure out what features to build next year.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that aren't trackable and require judgment. And I see this a lot on growth teams that want to take the factors of, say, a product roadmap and say, hey, we have how much engineering costs this will take, our expected impact, and maybe the design resources, who's going to work on what. And let's have a score for each of those and add it up and just work on the things that rank it. And I'm like, yeah, there's so much variance in each of these, and there's so much subtlety in the logic of what we want to work on that you need to have a curating human layer, an intelligent layer on top to try to be able to sort these things out. So you can't just take the number and run.
I think a lot of this comes, by the way, from a beautiful thing, which is people want to be egalitarian and friendly and want to find a way to resolve debates, in a kind of typical Californian beat around the bush. We're all happy. I can rationalize to you X, Y, and Z. But I do think there is value, especially if you're a wartime CEO, in having taste and making quick decisions quickly without really consulting the data. It's a bit crazy to say, but I strongly believe it to be the case. And so, I do a lot of founders I'm sure you speak to, I know I certainly speak to, are kind of like, well, should I be like trying to give direction and ask people, how do I incept people with ideas? And while I do think that, that's cute, there are moments where you don't incept, you ask people to do things. And at the end of the day, there's a reason why there's hierarchy in everything from every single great corporation to militaries to hospitals, to literally ants have hierarchies too. It's quite useful. And I think we've swung the pendulum a little bit too far occasionally in Silicon Valley, where the system does not work if everyone is providing strategic input. It just does not work. It's bad for all shareholders, even the employee who thinks they have a brilliant insight about something.
You want to build a machine that can take everyone's feedback and values it, and so that they continue to give it. And you also want everyone to understand they want to work in a company where they work on the best things. And that means some kind of editorial, some kind of editing involved, some judgment. And that is best done for the people that have the most context, the most view.
I think that's right. And then I think where things get really tricky is how should the leader be thinking about how important is it for the leader to constantly provide deep context and rationalizations for all the decisions they're making, which both takes time and, by the way, occasionally is impossible to do. And I think that's a very tricky question. For example, I mean, we'll bring up one exciting note to end on that I hope Twitter won't cancel me for. I think it's a very interesting way. It's a very interesting question to think about how you handle this with hiring. What do you tell the founder who's struggling because he says, look, there's someone my team wants to hire. I just get the sense that there's something off with them. And you know what? It doesn't fit into any rubric I can put on a piece of paper. There's something off with them. And say my company has 100 people. I know everyone here really well. I know the beat, and there's just something off tempo with this person. How does that's a tricky situation to handle. You can tell this person, yeah, admit them into your team because you can't rationalize it on the spreadsheet, or you're going to tell them, trust your gut. Because sometimes you can't explain the gut. And by the way, if you really want to thread this together with the theme of your career, machine learning algorithms, sometimes you can't explain what's going on.
Sure.
So,
I mean, there's an evolutionary side to this where you spend a few 100,000 years trying to make sure a tribe is well run. You can't always rely upon like knowing with certainty that there is a lion in a bush. Like sometimes you just have to react. And the mapping to like hiring, I think there's this notion of like the gelling of a team and personalities. And I definitely think that there is something to trust your gut. And this goes back to Milton Glassner, the 10 rules, and I'll link to that. But the idea is that after you meet with someone, do you feel like energized, like this is very exciting, or do you feel drained and toxic? And that is not something that is going to be picked up. Maybe it's in my tone of voice, maybe it's in something like how if I'm smiling, some body language, but right now we're not picking up any of those signals. And so it's just something where you have to trust your intuition for relationships, basically.
I think that's right. I got to run.
Cool. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.